Picture a 14-year-old boy standing in a marble palace, watching soldiers file into his throne room. He wears purple robes stitched with gold. A crown sits heavy on his head. And he knows, with absolute certainty, that these men have not come to protect him. His name is Romulus Augustulus. Little Augustus. Little Emperor. And in a few moments, without a sword drawn or a drop of blood spilled, he will become the last ruler of the Western Roman Empire. No flames consume the city. No barbarian horde breaches the walls. The end of Rome arrives not with thunder, but with paperwork. To understand how an empire dies quietly, you have to understand how slowly it had been bleeding. By the 5th century, Rome was a ghost haunting its own body. The legions that once conquered from Britain to Mesopotamia had shrunk to skeletal shadows. The treasury that funded aqueducts and amphitheaters now scraped together bribes to keep barbarian warlords from crossing the frontiers. The city of Rome itself had already been sacked twice in living memory. In 410, Alaric and his Visigoths had torn through the Eternal City for 3 days. 45 years later, the Vandals came from North Africa and stripped it bare for 2 weeks, carrying off treasures that had stood for centuries. But here is what most people miss: the empire did not collapse from outside pressure alone. It rotted from within. Civil wars had become so common that generals murdered emperors the way other men changed clothes. Between 455 and 476, the Western Empire cycled through 9 different rulers. Some lasted months. Some lasted weeks. One, a man named Petronius Maximus, ruled for exactly 77 days before an angry mob tore him apart in the streets. The real power had shifted. It no longer resided with the man wearing purple. It belonged to the military strongmen behind the throne, the magistri militum, the masters of soldiers. These were the kingmakers, the puppet masters, the men who could create emperors and destroy them on a whim. And increasingly, these military commanders were not Roman at all. They were Germanic warriors who had risen through the ranks, men born beyond the frontiers who now commanded Roman armies and Roman destinies. Enter Orestes. He was a Roman aristocrat with an unusual resume. He had once served as secretary to Attila the Hun. After Attila's death, Orestes made his way back to Italy, climbed the military hierarchy, and in 475, he made his move. He overthrew the reigning emperor, a man named Julius Nepos, and placed his own teenage son on the throne. That son was Romulus Augustulus. The name itself was almost a cruel joke. Romulus, like the legendary founder of Rome. Augustus, like the first emperor who transformed the republic into the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But this Romulus was no founder. This Augustus was no god among men. He was a child, a puppet, a placeholder while his father wielded actual power. The soldiers noticed. Specifically, the foederati noticed. These were Germanic warriors, mercenaries and settlers who fought for Rome in exchange for land and payment. By 476, they made up the backbone of what remained of the Western army. And they were tired of waiting for promises that never materialized. They wanted land. Real land. Italian land. 1/3 of the peninsula, to be precise. Orestes refused. It was possibly the last significant decision any Western Roman official would ever make. And it was a catastrophic miscalculation. The foederati found a new champion. His name was Odoacer. Odoacer was himself a barbarian, likely of Syrian or Hunnic descent, a veteran soldier who had spent years fighting for various masters across the crumbling empire. He was practical, ambitious, and utterly uninterested in maintaining fictions. In August of 476, he led the foederati against Orestes. They caught the former power behind the throne at Piacenza and executed him without ceremony. Then Odoacer marched his army to Ravenna. Ravenna was the real capital now. Rome had become too vulnerable, too exposed. The emperors had retreated to this marshy coastal city, protected by swamps and walls, ruling their shrinking domain from a gilded cage. Inside that cage sat Romulus Augustulus. 14 years old. Utterly alone. When Odoacer entered the palace, there was no battle. No siege. No heroic last stand on the steps of the throne. The boy simply surrendered. What happened next defined the strangeness of this moment. Odoacer looked at this child emperor, this symbol of 7 centuries of Roman rule, and he felt something unexpected: pity. He did not execute Romulus. He did not imprison him. Instead, Odoacer gave the boy a pension, a comfortable villa in Campania, and sent him away to live out his days in quiet obscurity. Some sources suggest Romulus lived into the 6th century, a forgotten old man who had once worn the purple. But the imperial regalia, the crown and robes and symbols of Roman authority, these Odoacer gathered carefully. And he sent them east, to Constantinople, to the Emperor Zeno, who still ruled the surviving Eastern Roman Empire. The message was clear. There would be no more Western emperor. The office was closed. The position was abolished. Odoacer would rule Italy, but he would not pretend to be Roman. He would be king of his own people, governing Roman subjects with Roman laws, but without the fiction of imperial succession. The Western Roman Empire did not fall. It was simply discontinued. The strangest part is how little changed immediately. In Rome itself, the Senate still met. Aristocrats still held their estates. Farmers still worked their fields. Merchants still haggled in the forums. The aqueducts still carried water. The roads still connected cities. Odoacer governed with Roman administrators, applied Roman law, and minted coins that looked remarkably like the ones emperors had issued for centuries. If you were a shopkeeper in Milan in 477, you might not have noticed that anything fundamental had shifted. This is the secret of Rome's fall. It was not an event. It was a process. The empire had been transforming for generations, its power fragmenting, its identity blending with the peoples who had settled within its borders. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus was simply the moment when everyone stopped pretending otherwise. But that transformation would accelerate. Over the following centuries, the unity of the Mediterranean world would shatter completely. Trade networks would contract. Cities would shrink. Literacy would decline. The infrastructure that Rome had built would crumble for lack of maintenance. New kingdoms would rise on Roman foundations. The Visigoths in Spain. The Franks in Gaul. The Ostrogoths, and later the Lombards, in Italy. They spoke Germanic languages but governed through Roman structures. They worshipped Christ through Roman churches. They wrote their laws in Latin. The ancient world was becoming the medieval world. And that boy in Ravenna, that teenager who handed over his crown without a fight, had become the unlikely hinge of history. We want empires to end in fire. We want final battles, heroic speeches, cities consumed by flame. We want our apocalypses to feel like apocalypses. But the truth is messier. Systems fail gradually, then suddenly. Power drains away through 1,000 small compromises until one day someone looks around and realizes there is nothing left to save. Romulus Augustulus did not lose Rome. Rome had been losing itself for generations. He was simply the last one holding the title when everyone agreed to stop pretending. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of all. The fall of Rome reminds us that civilizations do not always collapse in ways we can see. Sometimes they transform so slowly that the people living through them barely notice the world they knew is ending. Until one quiet day, a teenage boy takes off a crown, and an era that lasted 700 years simply stops.